So, how did that first quiz question go today? So, I will give you the answer, and the solution method is exactly as what we did in the first part. So, I repeated here the supply and the demand functions for both the market for potatoes and rice, and we know one thing: in equilibrium in both markets, supply needs to equal demand. So that gives us the following equations. If we look at the market for rice and we equate supply and demand, we get an expression of the price of rice as a function of the price of potatoes. Similarly, we can do this for the market for potatoes, and we get an expression of the price of potatoes as a function of the price of rice. Now we can replace, and here we should have an R. This PP should be PR, of course. And we could replace the PR on the right-hand side here by the expression that we found for the market for rice, and then solve for the price of potatoes. If we would do so and then plug back in the solution for the price of potatoes in the expression for the price of rice, if you do this correctly, then you will get that the equilibrium price of both rice and potatoes is equal to 50. So as predicted, because of the symmetric setup of the problem, the two prices are the same in equilibrium. And then you can plug in these two prices in either the supply and the demand, or the demand functions of the two goods, in order to get the equilibrium quantities. Now, it's very nice that we are able to find the equilibrium price in quantities in multiple markets if we study them together, but we also want to know whether the outcome that we get, the equilibrium outcome, to which extent this is a desirable outcome. So let's look a little bit at the equity and efficiency of the equilibrium outcomes. And these are two different things. So as economists, we often want to figure out what outcome is best for society as a whole, and this is something that we have in common with the non-economists in society, who also want to find out what is best for society as a whole. But of course, to find out what is best, you need to come up with a metric on how to measure different outcomes in terms of goodness. So, and this is important because if you, as an economist, have to advise the government who proposes to make a certain change to, for example, to introduce a tax, to give a subsidy, to change the structure of a market, then you want to predict what is going to happen to the equilibrium outcomes, and you may also want to say something about whether the new equilibrium outcome is better or worse, or whether certain groups in society benefit from it and some others don't. So in policy advice, this is quite important. But how do we determine what is best for society as a whole? Because that's a rather vague concept. So in some sense, we need to aggregate the utility levels of all the individuals in society. So if the utility of a person is an indicator of his well-being, then the sum of all the utilities should be an indicator of the well-being of society as a whole. But there are different ways to look at this aggregate utility. And we need to go beyond the utility function of an individual, but we need something like a social welfare function. So there are different approaches that we can use here, and the easiest thing to do, at least conceptually, is to just add up the utility levels, and then you arrive at what is called a utilitarian social welfare function. So that social welfare function, W, is very simply the utility, the aggregate utility of all individuals in society. And notice that in this expression, as this is given here, all people in society are weighted equally. Everyone is equally important. However, we run into a problem here because we already found out that, well, absolute utility levels don't mean anything. They don't represent the units of plane of pleasure that people experience. They just are a measure to rank people's observed choices. So, but we can do monotonic transformation, so we can multiply all utility levels by 2. The ranking of the different elements in the choice set doesn't change, so in fact it doesn't mean anything. So this is a problematic social welfare function. And what we need to do is to translate all these utility levels back into monetary terms. So if you prefer A to B, how much money are you willing to give up in order to have A instead of B? Once we know that one individual is willing to give up $2 and another person willing to give up $3, then we know that together these individuals are willing to give up $5. So bringing utility levels back to monetary terms allows us to aggregate them in a way that is meaningful. And this is exactly the approach that we already taken in computing the consumer surplus, which measured the difference between what people actually had to pay for an item and what they were willing to pay. So, and also with the producer surpluses that we studied in the chapter last week. But there are more social welfare functions possible. As said in the previous one, we just aggregated utility of all individuals in society, but you could also state that for society it's important to look after the people who are worst off. And that brings you to what is called the Rawlsian social welfare function, mentioned after John Rawls. And this is also the part of economics that comes quite close to the field of philosophy, because when you consider what is best, what is optimal for society, you already come pretty close to questions that are also important in the field of philosophy. So, and John Rawls, of course, is also an important name in that field. Now, what does the Rawlsian social welfare function look like? The idea is that you want to make the worst off individual in society as well off as possible. It's a very egalitarian welfare function, and it has the form W is the minimum of the utilities of the different individuals in society. So this social welfare function doesn't increase if you increase the utility of any individual in society that doesn't happen to be the worst off individual in society. W only increases if you make the person with the lowest utility the person who is worst off, if you make that person better off. Then you really attained an increase in social welfare. So this utility function, or this social welfare function, is very egalitarian. So it may sound very attractive, but of course this one has also problems because it's very hard to implement. And why is it hard to implement? Well, you need to find an individual in society who is worst off, and only then you can try to improve social welfare. That may be a very daunting task in practice. But as a benchmark, it's good to keep it in mind, the different social welfare functions. So, it's very hard to agree on a social welfare function. So that makes it a matter of ongoing debate, which is also what philosophers like a lot. So it's really hard to reach a final conclusion. So which social welfare function is best? And you can imagine that the Rawlsian approach resonates more with some political parties than with others. Other political parties may have different social welfare functions in mind, either explicitly or implicitly. And that's very hard to agree on. the right one. Is there a way out? Yes, there is a way out. And Pareto tried to find a way out of this debate. He took a different approach, and the question that he asked is, okay, let's think of the minimal condition that a social outcome should at least satisfy. So he asked the question, okay, can we formulate a condition that is the bare minimum that a social minimum should satisfy? And if that is not satisfied, then certainly it is socially not a good outcome. And he came up with situations where Pareto, well, he didn't call them that, but they are named after him. So he thought of the situation where you could make at least one person better off without making anyone worse off. And he figured that as long that is the case, then you did not reach yet an efficient outcome. And these are called Pareto improvements. As long as Pareto improvements are possible, as long as it is possible to reallocate resources in such a way that you make at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off, then you are able to make an improvement, a Pareto improvement. So the old allocation could not be an optimal outcome. And that's the fundamental idea that he came up with. So if the Pareto improvements are possible, then clearly it's not desirable from a welfare point of view. And you reach a state of Pareto efficiency when no Pareto improvements are possible anymore. So at a Pareto efficient outcome, these outcomes satisfy the condition that it's not possible to make, by reallocating resources, to make at least one person in society better off without making anyone worse off. Sounds good. This is something that all people can more or less agree on, that you should at least exhaust all possibilities to make people better off if it doesn't do any harm to other people. At the same time, this is a bare minimum. It's a very weak condition on outcomes. And I will tell you after the quiz why this is the case. So, but before that, we have a second quiz, and we consider two different allocations. In the first allocation, person A gets 3. So, and also think of getting 3 units, but also that these 3 units represent a utility of 3. Person 4 gets 4 units and person C gets 5. In the second allocation, person A gets 2, person B gets 5, and person C gets 7. So then looking at the different welfare functions, which of the two allocations is best if first we take a utilitarian perspective, and second, which one is best if we take the Rawlsian perspective? I think this is a quite straightforward question. If you're not able to answer it, then you should go back a couple of slides.